Cheers, Nico. Thank you. I haven't got my camera on. I don't know if anyone wants to specifically see me, but I can stick it on. There I am. Okay, thanks, Nico. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. So thanks for inviting me to come and chat to everybody. Nice to come and speak to the Foundry again. It's been a little while. So I was asked by Nico and a few others to come and talk a little bit about some of the use of ontologies in industry, specifically the OBO ones. But since there's other ontologies and resources we use, I'm going to kind of cover probably a slightly wider remit, but my focus will be mainly on OBO Foundry, but I'll touch on other bits as well. I think I don't need to introduce myself. Nico did a nice job of saying hello. Is Jane on the call as well? Just having a quick look.
Hi, yeah, I'm here,
Hey,
James.
Jane. Cool. Okay. So Jane, obviously, a lot of you probably know Jane Lomax as well, who I work with at SciBite. And some of these first slides are Jane's that I've stolen as well, so she's probably better placed to give them than me. But I think Jane can probably help with some of the questions you had towards the end as well. So when we do some of the Q&A stuff, I'll probably ask Jane to unmute and we can just have a chat through it. So, okay, and do interrupt as well. This doesn't have to be like a seminar. It'd just be quite nice if this was a conversation. So yeah, please just shout out if you've got questions as we go. Okay, obligatory commercial slide, since that's where I am now, and since I'm not in academia anymore. I'll keep this brief though, just to kind of give you a flavor of like what SciBite is, who we are, because some of you won't know who SciBite are at all, I'm sure. So we, I guess we quietly get on with our job of helping industry, mainly pharmaceutical companies, although sometimes some not-for-profits and charities and some smaller biotechs as well. To utilize ontologies with their textual data, primarily their textual data. So it's about, a lot of what we do is about doing named entity recognition. So about taking ontologies, turning them into vocabularies, enriching those vocabularies for that task, and then applying that to text at scale. So that's a key part as well, being able to kind of run huge corpora of text through it, you know, in a matter of a couple of hours. It's something we kind of have to do. I say quietly, we do, getting on with the job, we do work with the world's top 20 pharma now, so they're all our clients. So we work with a lot. It's kind of been an interesting ride coming from academia and industry. So, you know, the people we work with, they're super open about what they do. They're very forthcoming. So actually, we hear a lot from what they're trying to do and kind of get a lot of feedback from them as well. So it's really good, it's really useful. Yeah, I guess probably the big news for SciBite was in August last year, we're now, I guess, no longer independent SciBite. We were acquired by Elsevier, so we're now actually part of Elsevier. But SciBite itself, we still kind of operate as something of an autonomous entity within Elsevier. So we're still kind of semi-independent in what we do. Our use of ontologies. So there's a broad spectrum of resources we use for people who have a stricter definition of what an ontology is. You don't shout at the screen. I'm kind of using very broad strokes here. So not least because to some of our people who use our tools, well, they don't really care. They may look at all of these things ontologies and they just don't care. It doesn't matter so much to them. We use quite a few obo ontologies in what we do, in turning them into vocabularies. So they provide a lot of use for us, so they're incredibly valuable. Things like Uberon, the gene ontology, which of course Jane worked on for years as well, so knows very well. Even sometimes things like EFO, Orphanet ontology, which I also worked on. And then there's other things like Mesh and SNOMED and Medra and Celosaurus, things that are really outside of the obo Foundries domain, but are still very commonly used, sometimes more so in some industry parts than others. So there's a lot of resources that get used that are not necessarily ontologies. Kemble is another one. But are very useful in terms of providing a kind of backbone for IDs, sometimes a semantic backbone because they're linked to something like a graph as well. So they provide a lot of good things. They're open for use, which is really, really important. It's one of the most important reasons people take these things up, not least because they can use them openly themselves, but also with other people using them openly, like the public domain repositories, you can get some connection there. So the O in OBO is very important, I think. That there's some consistent design standards in obo Foundry. There's a consistent set across the ontologies. I think that's really important. And it's really nice to be able to plug in different ontologies and see how they all align. Even within ontologies that are not well connected to the obo Foundries, like Mesh, for instance, they at least have some internal consistent standards. So at least there's some internal consistency there in how they represent things. There's stable identifiers across the board. The closer those things are to a URI, the better, but at least they're stable and they don't just disappear. You can go back and find out where they are if they've been obsoleted. That's also important. Again, all this stuff that I think Obo has a really good handle on already, that they often represent a community consensus, sometimes differing communities, but there's some consensus there is important, and that you can apply these things to different analytics approaches. So enrichment is an obvious example where they get a lot of use. Common languages mostly, a lot of them have versions that we can use in OWL, but not always. So that's not always the case. So sometimes, and I think that's still an important one. In terms of applying these ontologies, a lot of our job is about named entity recognition. That's a lot of what we do with our customers. So this is really not ontologies as well, this is not an ontology issue. So taking the ontologies, really not utilizing a lot of the relationships for this. It's about taking the words, getting the words that you want, being able to recognize the different words that mean the same thing, they're the same entity, and then just link that back to an identifier. Obviously, if you're creating ontologies, you're very familiar with a class which has synonyms that all mean the same thing canonically. So that's the kind of thing we have to do with the NER tool. There's plenty of examples of where this can be more difficult than others, where the synonyms can be very varied. And actually context can be quite important as to whether or not the word means the thing you think it does or not when you're kind of programmatically trying to run these things through. So taking the words, finding all the synonyms for it, parsing the text, trying to understand the context to tag the thing you're interested in, and then hopefully link that back to some form of unique ID. So linking that back to the bigger thing, hopefully in an ontology, so it becomes something more like a thing. And then you can potentially utilize the wider graph. That is the ontology. So it's your basic NER. The kind of pipeline of what we do in our NER pipelines, the process looks a bit like this. So we take the public ontologies, resources, taxonomies, whatever they are. Jane runs an expert curation team. There's a hell of a lot of work doing expansions of the ontologies, a lot around synonym expansions, sometimes about setting rules on different terms, different synonyms on entities specifically sometimes that term I can understand. So we have this massive rule base of when you see a word in this context, it's okay, otherwise it's not. And a lot of that is really expert curation. It's not magic, it's work and expertise to do that. Again, it's not really an ontology issue, although of course ontologies can benefit from this. It's really more about the word level, the vocabulary level. So that's a lot of the work we do through our tooling. We have a big suite of testing, a massive regression test that goes through all of the different changes and make sure they still find all the things we think they should find and miss the things we should be missing. On the other side of this, we have some other mechanisms for helping out. So we've got this variation engine, so you don't have to necessarily write out all the synonyms for words. Sometimes there's rules you can apply and you can programmatically expand those things. And we also have machine learning modules in our new team formed last year called SciBite AI, which is using some of the language models to help us identify candidate entities that we can add into the ontologies as well. So we have things like a gene language model or a disease language model, etc. And they can flag new terms that we don't have in our vocabularies and say this looks like a drug you're missing or a synonym. They all feed into Termite, that's the NER engine, and then you can basically apply any sort of text to that at scale, and Termite tags it, and out the other end comes all the annotated data that you see in the bottom right. So that's your basic process for what we do a lot of the time with our ontologies. So turning them into vocabs, applying them to data at scale, tagging them on top of that. And at that point, typically, that's where we would hand that off to a lot of our customers, a lot of our user base, and they will do something else with the results of that. It's not the end, obviously. This is the middle bit of it. So I've mentioned a few of these already, but just, I guess, what the curation process involves, a lot of the time, I guess, that Jane's team have to spend doing. So synonym coverage is obviously a big one. As I mentioned, this is not really an ontology problem. It's not really an ontology task per se, although synonyms are very important. Clearly, when you're building ontology, you're not optimizing it for doing NER, although it can be very useful, at least as a side effect. So if you've got ontologies that have few synonyms per term, as some of them do, sometimes they say one, on average, they could be like one synonym a term. Often you have to do a lot of enrichment to make sure you can hit those terms consistently across all the different styles of text that appear. That's a big part of the job. You have to deal with coding styles, so we often see names, synonyms in ontologies that don't conform to the way the entity would be written in text, so you can see some examples there. So formally writing something as an acronym dash and then the full version of the word's not a very common way of seeing that written in normal sentence type text, so we have to deal with that and make sure that actual synonyms are covered, sometimes modify these things so they can be appropriately found. So there's a bit of dealing with coding styles, and then there's the ambiguity problem as well. So page one is a good example. You don't want to be tagging every page one in every document with something like a page family member one. So yeah, lots of obvious problems for NER. So there's quite a lot of our work is about that. And you can see just looking at the mesh vocabulary reproduce, little green sliver there is the kind of source terms. And then there's this huge extra on top of it that we have to expand out so we can actually apply that at scale to text, to scientific text. To be able to find all of the entities of interest. So that's a massive part of what we have to do on top of ontologies that exist to make sure we can hit all the different variations therein for each term, such as that one that I will not pronounce.
Hey, James, I have a question.
Hey, Nicole, yeah.
So do you ever give feedback back to the source ontologies to suggest that they add these as new synonyms to the source?
Yeah, so probably not all the variations of everything we add, but we do. Yeah, there is. I have a few examples of that later, actually, of some projects we've been involved with where there is some feedback that goes into this. Yeah,
cool.
And things like, well, maybe I'll talk about this later, but yeah, it's sometimes we find if there's a file that is, okay, I'm not going to name names. Sometimes we find a file that is not consistent or has a couple of issues with loading it into the OWL API or Protégé or whatever as well. So we do report those things back pretty quickly. So we try and be good citizens where we can.
Very nice.
There's a good discussion we should have at some point that I think will come up in a bit about the kind of marketplace idea. So we should definitely talk about that in a bit. Sure.
Cool.
I think moving a little bit away from the kind of NER part of this, kind of more on the ontology side of these. So when it becomes a little bit more about the ontology provides something useful. So I'm not naming companies, so I can't really name any of the people we work with specifically on each application. But things like prospective data capturing has become a major part of what they're doing now. So they recognize the concept that if you've got an ELN, rather than let people write free text in, that they can actually start to constrain that and make suggestions and do a little bit of kind of nudging towards entities that exist in their metadata standards, whatever they've picked for that, hopefully some ontologies that we like. That's very helpful. It helps them align it at source so they can do any on the data they've got previously, and then they can actually help prospectively capture better quality data up front. I don't have a slide on FAIR because everyone in this comment has heard of FAIR, but I guess it's worth saying that it's no longer just an acronym that kind of floats about. It's a really important part of pharmaceutical, most of industry's strategy now. They're really behind the kind of FAIR movement. They recognize the value of what they've got and what they're generating, and trying to make their data more reproducible, more reusable, etc. They see the standards that exist in the semantic space as an important part of that. I wouldn't necessarily say they see the obo Foundry as the solution to that. I think they see what goes on in the obo world as a part of that solution. I don't think there's any sort of settled, this is who you'll go to for this. And I have some examples later of what I mean by that. But you can see clearly there are some frictions perhaps between things like CDIS that go on, things like MESH and SNOMED, as well as things in the obo Foundry and Mondo. Human disease ontology, it's not always clear there's like a standard for doing that everyone should be using, but at least they certainly recognize that having a good semantic backbone for your metadata is important. So I think they see value in doing all this stuff. So yes, prospective data capturing, nudging them towards terms, and then actually using a bit more of the ontology. So we try to help provide tooling that helps them plug these things into things like ELMs, section lab notebooks, and other forms like registries for assays and things, where you can actually really start to get to use parts of the ontology to narrow down what it is you want to represent back to the users, even if it's something as simple as, well, just everything under this bit of the ontology. So you might want to narrow everything for species down to everything under mammalian in a taxon, for instance, because that's really the only thing they ever capture. Or multiple parts of different parts of branches of ontologies that they call tissue, whatever that may be, and say everything that's a child of this or everything that's a part of this, those sort of things. So they definitely recognize hierarchical relationships that help you branch out bits of an ontology are really important. And the hierarchical part of what they do is very important, I think, to them. Stepping away from things that are not easy to view as a hierarchy in a kind of tree type way. Usage is more sparse, I think, maybe because of UIs and viewing limitations. But for everything that I think you can see hierarchically, it's an easy sell, I think, to being able to plug in and use that stuff. Another thing that gets a lot of use is this application ontology. So something that we're all quite familiar with. The idea that there's a reference that is centrally ran, whether that's an obo-Foundry ontology that is then brought in-house and used as a reference internally, or something they've spun up themselves and they have their own standard for representing whatever it is they're modeling. The idea that that reference ontology is a model of some bit of biology, but actually that to power some applications, you often just need a little bit of that for something, depending on what the application is. And further than that, that you might want to refine that ontology to meet the application audience's needs, is something that we see a lot of across the industry. So it's a very kind of practical approach to how you can deploy ontology. So that kind of view, fitting those subsets, gluing them together in some coherent way, making local changes to the application to help it be presented in a way that's consumable or fits what the application is trying to do, is very common. Again, we provide tooling that helps them to do this stuff, but I think it's an obvious way of trying to plug together parts of ontologies that are representative for a particular problem, and not kind of have to make them consume the whole of whatever NCBI taxonomy, for instance, or gene ontology, when that's not really what they need. So that ability to pull slims out, glue them together, and then utilize them, very important, I think. And that's a really big use we see to help them consume ontologies and applications and apply them to data. I want to mention some work that Jane was involved with and Annalie Carlson was involved with, the Pistoria Alliance. So we mentioned some of the public domain work we did. So we were involved in a project with the Pistoria Alliance that was called the SEED project. And that was about, with other partners in industry and academia, about just adding some extra assay curation data for PK/PD assays. So there were some gaps here in the public ontologies, especially in the bioassay ontology, which they were using, the stakeholders were using, and they wanted that enriched. So we worked with them. We weren't paid to do this. This is what we did, contributing back to the public ontology. So there was a couple of hundred new classes that were added, 700 and something new synonyms. A lot of mappings were added as well to existing terms to be able to link that back to things like the CDISC SEND standard. So this is work that we've done and pushed back out to the public domain. I'm aware the BAO is not part of the obo-Foundry officially, I guess. I think OBI would probably be your take as as the standard in assay as well. But I guess just to say again, as I mentioned, there's not, I think, one standard for some of these ontologies within the industry. A lot of the time it's kind of looking at what's there and seeing how best it matches what they've got. And then at that point, they'll take it and they'll use it. Even though sometimes there are funding gaps in some of these ontologies. Sometimes they take it on and will just own themselves to extend it because it best fits what they currently have. So that's something we've worked on. That's in the public domain. This term enterprise knowledge graphs comes up a lot. So again, it's another one of those, I've got a third kind of buzzword after this as well. But it's another one of those phrases that comes up a lot. And knowledge graphs we've all heard about. I think probably a lot of people on this call have worked in building triple stores. I certainly have, and Nico certainly has when I was at EBI and we built the RDF linked data store there as well with Simon. So yeah, we're familiar with triple stores, etc. But this idea that there's something useful about building a kind of very broad knowledge graph, what they call enterprise knowledge graph, that spans many different domains within some of the larger industries, I think is important. It's another one of those things have happened in academia a little while ago, and now I think industry is starting to come around to this idea that it's useful, it's something they want to do. So it's no longer, I think, just the domain of people who are doing a little bit of R&D and testing whether this works. I think they're trying to build these for real. They're trying to deploy these for real in proper applications and use them to solve proper problems and things like target validation. So I think this is another area where I think ontologies will play, or are playing, in fact, a big role. Firstly, in being able to type all of your entities and then tie that to some graphs, or typing your data, extending that and putting it in as triples within your graph in the first instance. using the relationships that exist in ontologies already. So that's also extremely useful that there's a consistent set across the obo-Foundry. I think that's very, very useful and get used. And then having these sort of bridging schema, whatever you want to call them, that you can also create small ontologies that might well link together the bits of ontologies. So you can have something that bridges different bits of your semantics. So you can start to have these easy ways of querying. I think this was one of the outcomes we had of the EBI RDF platform, which was that sometimes you need these kind of convenience triples where you help you make those queries across the graphs more easily, so that the link between a drug and a target is very small. But there's a much bigger way to get there too. It's just that sometimes you just want a drug target and that's it. So I think this gets a lot of interest within industry as well. As I said, we see a lot of this too. Final buzzword. There we go. The final one, buzzwordy wise, is probably in broadly AI. Obviously, ontologies, yes, they're AI, they're knowledge representation, but specifically around machine learning, deep learning, really, I'm talking about. So I mentioned something we utilize. So we don't kind of do blue sky on this. We are using language models that are already in existence, that things like the BERT of this world, so transformer-based language models. We're using them, they're very good. I think the last couple of years have seen amazing advances. A lot of our partners use this too. So it's something that a lot of people look to be able to parse and understand language. So I think they're useful. The role of ontologies in this for us is probably a bit more lightweight, in truth. So I know there's work, and we fiddled a bit with using relationships and trying to embed them into vector models, etc. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. I think it's quite noisy still, so there's probably promise there, although we haven't really been able to find a solution that we could kind of say that's good. We could roll that out and let people use it yet. The one thing we do is be able to tag potentially text sets with entities of interest, and then use that to narrow down our training set and say, okay, we found all the entities we want, now we can train a model with it. We have this tool called TextPress, which is kind of like a rule-based pattern matching algorithm. And we utilize that to kind of do a bit of bootstrapping when we want to build a training set. So it's not really using a lot of the ontology smart, but it is able at least to use the ontology words to narrow down your training sets. And that's actually incredibly useful because it gets us curate these things often so that we can really utilize them properly. But yeah, at least it gives us something more than nothing to go with. We have done some work that we've published as well. So we did a bit of work around kind of optimizing the curation pipeline for this, that I've got a link to the preprint there, that we did with some of the folks at EBI and at the Signor database in Italy as well. So we did that kind of openly and have published the model openly as well that we did for that. So that's available if anyone's kind of interested in how we're using ontologies to train models. Some other stuff, I guess I've kind of bundled some stuff in a slide, probably because it wasn't quite worthy of its own slide yet, maybe not buzzwordy enough. But other uses I see, I think ontology mappings come up time and time again. This probably was worth its own slide, really. The mapping problem, it persists.
James seems to be, the connection seems to be down. We'll wait for...
Yeah, and I thought it happened before, right? Just for a few seconds a while back, and then...
Yeah, I thought it was me first, but now that everyone
me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's 5 o'clock in the UK. So everybody goes goes online. I think often the bandwidth drops this time of day.
How annoying.
We lost you at when you said that the mappings could have used their own slides, and then you disappeared.
Okay, cool. I said something amazing after that, so now I forget what it was.
Oh no.
Never mind. Okay. Where was I? So mappings. Yeah. Okay. I mentioned mappings. Let's not labor that. I've probably spoken at it by myself for 3 minutes now. So yeah, mappings are important. I think. Yeah, we get asked about mapping internally to other resources, from internal to external, and then yeah, external to external as well. So all those different combinations. So I think they are increasingly looking for tools that can help them do that. Obviously, it's not magic. The higher quality, the better. So there's always some trade-offs, I think, there. I mentioned reasoning in the slide, so it's very, very sparsely used, I think, possibly because it's just not understood very well. We see a little bit of use of it, but I think, interestingly, of very low concern. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of that's because the degree to which relationships are used, so object properties are used, is probably more limited, I think. There'll probably become a point where if they start adopting other class descriptions, this will become a bit more important. But at the minute, I would say very little use of that. Interestingly, though, shackle is getting probably more use. I have more conversations about shackle than other things. So, which is also quite complicated, I think. So that's kind of interesting, I think. I've still seen some issues using shackle on one big project where it just wouldn't scale for validating some of the big data. So I don't think that's a kind of panacea for validating everything that comes through in ontology. But anyway, that's certainly something that gets used a bit. QTT, so the quick terms template stuff. So we support the usage of that in our tooling now as well, which is quite nice to see after all the years of using it through Obi. So we support the usage of that. The ability to kind of put stuff in a spreadsheet, set some stuff on a header, and then push that into a platform to load an ontology in is super useful. Everybody likes that. Sometimes need a bit of help with the headings, but that's incredibly useful, I think. And I think the fact that Robot supports that is very important. We also use Robot ourselves for some of our internal validation. When we look at ontologies, we run some of our tests through Robot as well. So that's kind of useful too. So I think that's all very cool. Robot's very cool. Common challenges. So I'll let Jane talk about that one maybe towards the end, I guess. But I think we see that one of the areas we see people extending most in the ontologies they utilize is in bioassays. So it still represents a bit of a gap, I think, for the pharma specifically relevant part of bioassay ontology. So there's a question as to whether that's really something a public body should care about. I guess that's for you folks to discuss, I suppose, whether I'm sure you don't want to have to code your assay ontology all around what one pharma wants to do. And probably no should, but there's probably gaps there I think that would be worth bridging. One of the questions that was asked about I've got at the end, which is your list of things you'd ask, was about funding and so on. I think if you were going to look at one area maybe to approach industry to try and get funding, I think bioassays is a good one. I think that would be somewhere where a lot of industry would rally around that, I think, to kind of try and fill some gaps in. As I mentioned, QTT could be a good approach to that. So not necessarily making them build ontologies, but filling spreadsheet stuff. So I think that's a gap anyway. I think there's definitely something we see. I mentioned mappings already. They're always looking for better ways to do mappings. We've been involved in the Pistoia mapping project, where we looked at different approaches to doing this as well. I think it's still not a solved thing. So the more approaches that are into mapping, the better. I think we'll be looking at machine learning in the near future as well. There's some impact of real-time imports, which is kind of an odd one, but so just hear me out. So the idea that you can take an ontology, and some of the ontologies that then import from the web, you take an hour file, you then import from the web all the bits that are required to build the ontology using the import statement. The challenge can come if you load an ontology now, and then in 3 months you reload that ontology in again. If those imports are live, so they're not a versioned file somewhere, suddenly you can go from 3,000 classes to 3,050 classes, which might not seem like a huge amount, but actually for kind of provenance and working out what's going on, especially because we report on diffs that come through the ontologies and so on as you load them, it sometimes raises flags. Why have I now got 50 extra classes? I haven't done anything. So that can create some challenges in how you deal with that, that kind of living document. I think that's a problem. And there's also some problem with dangling classes from imports as well that can come in. I've got an example of one of the things I mean on that one as well. I can show you.
Hi, James. This is Jim Balhall.
Hey, Jim.
I want to comment on that imports issue, because I think we've been making some changes related to that. For some of the ontologies, at least for the main release, where instead of having imports that are dynamic, we have the imports just merged in, and so it's a single static file. And
Cool.
I didn't know if you had noticed that, and I think HPO is released that way now, probably Ubron. But so, and then we have another file that kind of doesn't automatically import anything, and it's just the core, like that ontology. So yeah, I think that's an issue. But
one that's being resolved. That's
out.
awesome. Yeah, that's perfect, Jim. Actually, I think that would at least resolve that, I think, as well. So I mean, at least in the Obo Foundry, I think if that's what the Obo Foundry eventually adopts and is rolled out across, I think within the Obo world that would be perfect. Obviously, outside of that, that's their issue. But at least in the Obo, you've got a handle on that, I think. So gaps, opportunities, I think you asked me a little bit about this as well. So I guess I mentioned bioassays. I think that's one. Instrumentation as well. I think, devices and so on. I think there's still a lot of devices and instrumentation we have to extend, and we see a lot of the industry doing themselves to cover what they use instrumentation wise. Adverse event is quite an interesting, complicated one. It's something we apply machine learning to quite a bit because it's quite a hard problem. Obviously not always the same as a disease, as an indication. The context is important. So there's probably scope there for something to think about what an adverse event ontology would look like, I guess. I think there's been some work done in this. I'm sure there was an AEO at some point as well. But I guess my message there is drug safety and reporting is one of the single most use cases that I get asked about. So it's very, I think it's really, really high up on most of the industry's kind of wish list to try and address adverse event problems. So that's a big one, I think. NCBI taxon, I think more usable subsets. I seem to remember Bjorn had produced some really nice slim versions of NCBI taxon back in the kind of OB days. I think, good subsets of that would be super useful if they don't exist, just because most of the time they're using a tiny fraction of the full thing. So I think that would be very useful. Mapping standards. So we help, in our tooling, help people do and add mappings in. We will adopt the mapping standard that Nico, I think, initially proposed, that obviously we saw as well. I think we're going to adapt that, so we'll use that in our tooling as well, so they get added in that sort of standardized way. I think that's a really nice win. So we'll do that as well. And the last one I had, so Simon, when I was chatting with Simon, he was mentioning this, I mentioned the dangling classes thing we get sometimes from imports which come in, and obviously I understand why they're there. I think one of the things we've been looking at were ways to try and hide that stuff. And Simon was telling me that in OLS, they have this idea of a preferred root tag on classes that you can add. So on the left, that's obviously your CL view of just importing the ontology, and clearly there's some kind of stuff that's coming in from some of the imports there. But this idea that you can tag a certain branch of classes and say, well, really, this is the main entry point for most users. So let's just kind of hide the other stuff by default, give them the main entry point, which is probably something around cells. And if they want to see the rest, it's there. They can still search on it. They can still extend on it if they want, so they can still explore and browse on it. But maybe by default, we'll hide some of that stuff. I think that's pretty useful. I think that's something we will adopt in our tooling as well. And I guess the call would be maybe it's something that Obo could potentially have a property for optionally as well. So you could have a kind of preferred visible root term as well. Okay, I'm just going to check and make sure I'm still live for one thing. Okay, AO, one arrow. 2 AOs, okay, fair enough. Okay, I think that was all I had kind of slideware, and then I kind of wrapped up some of your pre-talk questions that you'd sent on. So I guess if you've got questions, please just unmute and ask them. This was sent previously, so I'm happy to kind of just go through this with Jane if you want and try and address some of these as much as I can, but also happy to hear other questions. I'll try and answer as openly as I possibly can. So otherwise I'll start here. If that's okay, Nico.
Can I make it just a meta comment to some extent? This was, first of all, fantastic, James. Really, really cool stuff. And obviously, this is kind of you're reporting on the practice of really doing real work with the ontologies. And I think to some extent, the one thing we have to be careful of in terms of feedback is that, like, say, just the mapping example. It's supposedly the obo-foundry could fix some things at the source, at least for within the obo-foundry ontologies. So what I see all the time is essentially other people, or like the lack of use of reasoning. I know, my guess is most of the reasoning will immediately say everything here is inconsistent. And you're not getting any useful inferences because people use different relations and whatever. So, I mean, if we are fixing those things, that might then address some of the issues. And so we don't need to have a better mapping tool. I mean, the obo-foundry's job doesn't have to be to make a better mapping tool or to make other ways of, or to ignore reasoning. I think we should make those things work better. So I guess that would be kind of my question also then to you, the new question. When you've already outlined a number of things, like what would we be doing that makes obo-foundry better, and what would make you say, oh, I'm going to always choose obo-foundry ontologies because these things are at least, if I do that, that's better.
Yeah, I think that's tough. I totally agree on the first bit you said, though, Bjorn, as well. So I think my suggestions here are really just, they're just they're observations, they're things I hear from people that I'm really just passing on. I'm definitely not suggesting obo-foundry become, a fountain for all mappings or synonym addition as well. It's something we spend a lot of time doing, and obviously Jane's team have done over a lot of years to make that work. I'm not suggesting that that's something the obo-foundry should do, really. Shouldn't really necessarily care about NER tooling at all. Although having synonyms is useful. Same with reasoning. I think it's useful. There may be some issues internally as to how well that works. I think some of that is just a gap in understanding, perhaps, in industry, that, obo-foundry is probably hearing what they're using and industry is probably here, and there's always a bit of lag in catching up. I predict at some point they will want to use that stuff because we already see it. They're already a bit more familiar with ontologies just from the work we're doing with them. So they're becoming ontologists, I guess. And then there'll be a point where they'll want to do some of that inferred hierarchy stuff, and then they'll start to think, well, how could I do that actually? How can I manage all of this multiple inheritance? I think at that point, the reasoning will play more of a role. I think there's a few things, I guess, in terms of like, how could we make the obo-foundry more prominent, make the standard? I think there's a big part of it is in the kind of outreach and training that goes on. I think if the obo-foundry, we sometimes get asked to do training courses and we don't, it's not really what we do. So we don't really do a lot of training courses. I think the obo-foundry could do that stuff. I think the knowledge that as a collective, the obo-foundry has is immense. I don't know if there's another, ontology type institute in the world that has that much knowledge. I think you guys have so much. You could do that, I think, and you could become a kind of fountain of knowledge where if you did those sort of training courses, I think they'd do that. I think they'd come to you.
Would you say training courses around like building stuff or across the boards, like building ontology pipelines, using how to extract information from ontology? Like what do you have? What are the most frequently asked for kind of tutorials that you're talking about?
I would say, sorry,
Go
James.
go for it.
It's probably best practice. So if you're developing multiple ontologies, what's the best practice? How should we do this? What principles should we apply? That's we get asked that all the time. And there's not really any, there's not much we can refer people to either. There's not much online that you can say, "I'll go and read this." So yeah, training would be right up there. Agreed.
That would be a good one. And I think although I clearly have some feet in the obo-foundry camp. So I do talk about the obo-foundry quite a bit when I'm speaking with, our customers and our users as well, because, I advocate for what I think the obo-foundry tries to do. I also think that although you can't go in there and say our ontology is the best, I think by just communicating the best practices that you follow, that you have these consistent standards, the things I kind of said very early on about the openness, the willingness to take in feedback and make changes to public ontologies, the fact that you have common language, you have common development standards, all that stuff. I think they're really big reasons as to why the obo-foundry should become the standard in a lot of cases. I talked about this previously. I think the obo-foundry should try and think of itself as a standard and then push itself as such onto industry and say, they love standards. They love a standard when this is a standard for doing something. That authority adds something, I think. And I think the obo-foundry should think of itself as that. But yeah, a lot of it's just about, probably some knowledge sharing, I guess, knowledge exchange.
That's really awesome. I mean, you have some of these questions. You've still have them here on the slide. Do you want to go through them yourself in the absence of other people chiming in, or?
For sure, yeah. I think Jane probably can take the first few as well. Do you want to do the first few, Jane?
Yeah. So our ontology is used to enhance NLP. So they're kind of, they're fundamental. it's basically that's what we do. Ontologies are at the core. So our sort of specialism is NER rather than NLP. So we use public ontologies wherever we can find them, and use those to pull out the entities, and then we do some kind of lightweight NLP on top of that. So finding patterns, like finding a disease within a certain number of words to a drug, that kind of NLP. So yeah, they're absolutely at the core of that. How useful are synonyms exact related? Are they used? So yeah, so we totally use the synonym kind of categories, the obo synonym categories, and they're massively useful. So it means that you can easily filter out things which shouldn't be used directly as a synonym that need some further review. So for example, when we did the gene ontology, NER vocabulary, we could just take the exact synonyms as they were, just throw those straight in, and then we could kind of parse through the related and broad and narrow synonyms and just check which ones we could safely add and still be pretty sure we're going to pull out the correct entities. So I mean, I agree with James that I don't think it's the obo Foundry's job to add exhaustive synonyms, because we're using it for a particular application, but where they are used, I think that's they're super useful. Where it's hard is where they're not and they're used in a kind of like all thrown into a big pile, so without naming names. So where gene names are used to describe functions or diseases are used to describe genes, it's kind of because then we have to go pick through and pull all that stuff out manually, which is obviously quite time consuming. The definitions are used.
Jane?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi, Melanie.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you about the, those approximation? Because I thought the point that James made earlier about the context and depending on the project you're working in, some ontologies may be more or less relevant or accurate, or the adverse event, depending on the country you're in, something is an adverse event or not, depending on the guide. So all those approximation, whether they're synonym or context-based, how do you factor those in? Do you have some sort of threshold for confidence or validation, or how do you factor that in?
So we tend to work, because we sort of work on a case-by-case basis. So we'll typically come in with a specific use case for a particular company, and then we'll optimize around that. So we'll select the appropriate ontology, and then we'll optimize it for that particular use case. So we sort of do a generic version, which is applicable to as many use cases as possible, and then tailor it according to the particular use case, if that makes sense.
Do you have criteria you can share for that tailoring? It's a question we've been wondering with Fuchi. I think she's on the call as well. How do you know which ontology is the best? And I know ontology metrics has been a long-term topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do have like a sort of table of like different use cases and the ontologies we'd use in those particular use cases, but I mean really it's only a rule of thumb, but I'm happy to share that. Because some of them where there isn't a public ontology, we sometimes create our own with ML or just from a rule base. So some of them don't map exactly to a particular ontology, but generally they do. So they will have like pharmacovigilance, and then this is the set we'd use, and then like standard R&D, these are the set we'd use. So I'm happy to share that, Melanie.
Great, thanks. That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, and so definitions, definitions we use those, we display those in the ontology browser editor, and they are useful because often that's the only thing you can sort of use to like get some context. And so pattern-based synonyms, I mean, we sort of add the pattern-based stuff on afterwards anyway. So I think for us, just the core synonyms is most useful, and then you can do the automatic kind of expansion of those automatically. So I think the sort of core ones are more useful, and sort of the breadth rather than expanding them for on a per term basis. And so yeah, so improving our ontologies for NER, that sounds like a planted question for me, and it isn't. So I think just typing them, exact related, the sort of standard obo Foundry types is super useful, because then we can sort of pre-filter them. So I think that's probably the main thing, and then just increasing the breadth, but that's what we do anyway, so we're just grateful enough that we can sort of bring this stuff in.
I think one of the things we do consume more of now, and actually our users are starting to use more, are other kind of annotations on annotations, so that what they typically tend to call tags on annotations. So that ability to make a synonym, and then on the synonym itself assert more annotations about who did it and what the source was, all that sort of stuff, those extended triples. So we're consuming more of that. We're letting our users edit those things more as well, and they absolutely get the idea that you can add a synonym and you can add more tags to that as well. So I think we utilize that now, starting to use that. They are going to start using that heavily, I think. So that's a really nice mechanism, I think, for potentially layering on more metadata onto some of the textual parts of it, which is obviously of interest to us. But I think if that's of interest to the obo Foundry, that's definitely a mechanism we're exploiting. Okay, what do you see as the main business case of obo ontologies at the moment? So I don't know who asked the question, but I guess if the question is what's the case for using obo ontologies across industry, I guess is what you're asking. I think it's the stuff I mentioned very early on. So I did try and address some of these questions through the slide. So I think that kind of set of the fact that it's open and they can just use it and run with it, I think is a really big one. They don't have to wrangle licensing and so on. I think that's a massive flag now. Licensing, have lots of lawyers looking at licensing and stuff. So I think that's a really big one, that it's open. I think the cadence of releases and updates is important. So again, it's very transparent in obo. I think when things are being updated and what the versions are, etc. I think that's also really important. And then just in general, the consistency of the representations, and that there's part of this was just, it has the words I need, in honest truth. So when you're asking what ontologies are best suited for what, a lot of the time it's, I've got 200 things and I want to make sure they're in the ontology I'm interested in. So can you tell me if they're in or not? That's a lot of the entry. So the coverage is really important. And then after that, it will be exploring it and seeing if the structure matches the structure you want. Is the cancer hierarchy exactly how I want it to be represented? It's not always a big barrier, because now we provide mechanisms to layer on changes on top of a reference. It becomes less of a barrier. They can make some fiddles to it without breaking, breaking Mondo, but still use Mondo. So I think that's less of a barrier these days. Perception of general awareness and usage of obo Foundry. So I think the perception of the obo Foundry is probably less so. I think they don't know the words obo Foundry quite as much. They definitely know the obo ontologies though. So I think they come up a lot. All the ones you'd be familiar with come up quite a bit. So I think they're very aware of what's being built. Perhaps not always the provenance of where it comes from. So that could be something that I could probably do with some more outreach. As I say, I do try and talk about the obo Foundry when we're talking about this stuff. So I do mention it, but I think maybe that tracing it back to the obo Foundry as an umbrella is perhaps sometimes missing. What could obo do to improve stuff for industry? So I think we've talked about that a fair bit of length, I think.
But I think licensing is a big one, isn't it, James? I think, but actually the obo Foundry does that really well.
Which one, sorry?
Licensing, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Having to wrangle different licensing, trying to figure out what you're allowed to use it and what you can use it for is like such a headache.
It's a huge one, yeah.
This is James Overton. Thanks, guys, for answering this question. I really appreciate it. So I have pretty good visibility over a fair chunk of obo for the last 10 years. And I wanted to kind of ask the inverse of this question. I can't think of a single example of where pharma has contributed anything to my code, my robot, or any of the ontologies that I work on. So what can we do to actually get them to pay back? You've made the case that they get a lot of benefit out of the work that we've done. And I don't see them actually benefiting us. Could we do something that would change that?
So I think framing it as what are the opportunities that you could collaborate with industry is probably the way I would look at this. there's a few different ways I think you could approach this. I think the idea of industry kind of, broadly funding the obo-foundry is very difficult. It's something we've bounced, I think, between the obo-foundry, even when I was working more heavily over the years, have bounced back and forward a lot of time. It's really difficult, is the truth. I think there is scope for projects that are focused around an application that is of interest to them, at a given time. I think there's definitely scope for doing those sorts of bits of work. And obviously there are things like IMI projects as well. So I think there's scope to do something around a domain. Bioassays I've mentioned, adverse events, drug safety, all those things are really high up on their lists, I think. They're probably good places to start. Will they contribute to your code? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Maybe. Don't really contribute to our code either.
So I haven't even seen a pull request for a new term that I can think of that came from a pharma.
So I think
in the stuff that I do, yeah.
That's really fair. That's definitely fair. And actually, I've previously talked at length, including with Nico, actually, we've had chats about this idea that I've banged on about for years at the EBI's industry program about having a term marketplace where, there's kind of like a single point of entry where if you're a person who is in whatever industry, wherever, you've got a term, you go, I don't know where this goes, but I'm going to submit it to the obo-foundry. They will deal with it for me and it will end up in the right place. And then I'll get a notification to say, your ticket's closed, we've added your thing for you. I think while that might be a nice idea in practice, I think in reality, probably just won't happen. I don't see a massive willingness for industry to want to do that. Also, the onus on you guys to basically have a public help desk that someone has to man every other day and deal with tickets. And so, I think it's very high. So I think the barrier from submitting and then the barrier for you guys to have to triage that in almost like a commercial way, that you'd have to deal with tickets like we have to with our customers. And honestly, it's, there's a lot of them. It's a lot of work manning these help desks.
I think, to be honest, James,
very high.
Some of this, like SciBite, can broker as well, because I know that when we're working heavily with a particular ontology, often we find if there's a big chunk missing that we've had to add, if we feed that back, then we can act as that sort of interface, because we obviously we've had feet in both camps, so we know how it works. I think there's a lot of the time there's people in pharma companies aren't aware that you can contribute terms and what the process is and how straightforward that is and what you have to do. And we do constantly push this, say if it's missing, then you could just go and add it in this tracker. But yeah, I just don't think there's that kind of, that's not really in the culture. And but as I say, we do broker that where we can, and we might be able to provide some tooling one day as well that helps that, I think.
Okay, so thank you for the answer. It's very unsatisfying, but I understand that it's the best answer you can give.
So
yeah, I know.
James and Jane, sorry. One of the industry sponsoring models that I've seen in other open software kind of tools is just to say there's some kind of foundation or so, and they would say, okay, I'm an industry sponsor or so, and you actually get nothing out of it apart from having your logo appear somewhere. But to give the feeling of, okay, I'm contributing back, I'm using this open software tool or this open thing, and I'm here, I'm a gold partner or whatever, and they feel better about actually doing requests or asking for features. Because there's good people going to industry like you are. And if you're working for Pfizer or whatever, and then saying, okay, why don't we contribute whatever X dollar, is that something you would think is a viable idea? We had toyed with it, but we'd have to set up kind of the payment collecting infrastructure thing.
I think that, have you heard of the Pistoia Alliance, which is a kind of, non-profit?
Yeah, we have. It's problematic when we look in detail, but yeah.
Right. I would go via Pistoia for that kind of thing. Ask their advice, get to know those people, because that's the kind of, that will be the interface to those people in industry. But I think if you ask for, individually, if you ask for things like letters of support or work on collaborations, that's the other way to go. That's the other route to go as well. I think within a pharma company, there isn't a mechanism to, fund something that's like a core infrastructure project like the obo-foundry. There just isn't there's not, you can't apply for funding within a pharma company to do that. There's not a business case to do that. So I think, Pistoia might be the way to go.
I think there's a stepping stone of evolution here. The companies are just starting to get friendly to the notion of using external vocabularies in their internal database systems. So the training barrier is the first barrier. And then once you get ontologists in-house, then you can start to get curation participation. I'm starting to see that with the food community. But James is saying is a little bit different, which is tool development. And I can see that has to probably happen after companies start participating in the curation directly.
I think that's fair. I guess if you kind of flip this for a second and imagine you work in a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company, and you've got an assay term, and you think this would be better in OB actually. The cost for you to kind of think, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to submit this term to OB, and I'm going to get that assay term out in the public domain. The kind of startup cost to do that is not just, can I find the OB tracker and do it? That's probably reasonably straightforward. It's also, am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to put an assay that we're developing in whatever pharmaceutical company into the public domain, and make sure that, you know, that's actually legally okay for me to do that stuff? Same with code development as well. If I start contributing to these projects, I think that kind of mindset is difficult to get past, I think, because obviously there's frameworks in place for how they connect up to these public organizations and give things back to it. So that's probably at a higher level than just, you know, your user using your ontology ultimately. I think it's not, there's definitely some barrier there, I think. I don't easily know how to get around that. I mean, I think we can help a bit in brokering it, but, and some of those things, if we're adding it and then we're giving it to them, then yes, we could probably just push that to the public domain, as Jane says we do and have done in the past. But if it's something we've done for them, we've built out an assay extension for something they're doing, and then we say to them, actually, could we take that? Because that may or may not have target details in as well. Can we put that in the public domain? The conversation that probably has to go on to get that out there is probably tricky, I think. So there is some startup cost, I think, as well to getting it through there, just to kind of like flip a little bit to, you know, some of the people. I don't think I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think it's not that there's goodwill. I don't think that they don't see the value of doing it or that they wouldn't want to, but it's not always quite as easy as that. At least that's what I see.
Thank you very, very much, James. I think this was hugely interesting. I've taken a lot of notes. There will be definitely a lot of follow-up conversations on some of the things you have said. And yeah, thanks definitely for the talk.